Welcome, everybody, joining us this morning. Your host is Olga Gtamanova. Welcome to the Ukraine Media Center, Forum. The ongoing aggression of the Russian occupier still going on today, the 1st of June, the International Day of Protection of Children. Everyone understands very well now that the situation that the Ukrainian children have found themselves in is unprecedented. We have witnessed what had happened this morning. We know that this is the environment where our children are living. It's a horrendous thing to say. It's a tragedy for the children as well. This is why we are talking about the Ukrainian children that are living under the Russian control. What is our role in caring for their future and securing such a future? Welcome. Let me introduce the panel of today. Ohannisian Sinyuk is the legal expert at the Zmina Center for Human Rights. Valentina Potapova is the head of the National Advocacy in the field of education at the Almenda Civic Educational Center. Ksenia Kornienko is the lawyer of the Regional Center for Human Rights. Anastasia Pantaleeva is the head of the documentation department of the Media Institute for Human Rights, and Evgenia Kopalkina is a lawyer at the Ukrainian Legal Advisory Group. Friends, welcome. I should perhaps start with you, Ohannisian Sinyuk. Shall we kick off by discussing what Russia is doing to our children, what we see, what we are taking record of? From the start, I should start with the statement that children represent the most vulnerable sector of society, and this also reflects in the norms of their protection. But when we talk about the grounds for the transfer of children, there are additional restrictions. From the occupied territories, children can be removed or transferred only under one condition: if their health is immediately threatened. All the other reasons are illegal. More to the point that even if their health is threatened, the state and government must do the steps to identify where their parents are, where their guardians are. And even if the children agree for such a transfer, it's not a legal ground. The occupying state is under the condition not to intrude into the actions of the child caring institutions in the occupied territories. Russia is not doing this. More to the point that they have begun transferring the children's facilities to the Russian territory or into the deeper occupied territories. It began right from the beginning of the war. We know for sure now that on the 19th of February, in the children's resort called Romashka, more than 400 children coming from the occupied territories in the Donetsk region were found, including the children's boarding house number 1. The director of that school gave an interview on the Russian television saying that the decision was made immediately and children agreed to come to Russia and to be adopted by the Russian families. Another way of transferring Ukrainian children is the so-called going to the resorts, both in the occupied Crimea and in other Russian territories. It's a full-scale operation. In autumn, the head of the so-called occupying territories, Mr. Saldo, claimed that within such a temporary camping of children, more than 5,000 children would be transferred. Until that point, 1,500 children were already deported. Such steps include the so-called re-education, including educational curricula, according to the Russian educational curricula, and these children are engaged into the Russian cultural space. For the so-called complex children, they are under the special program of the military education. When Maria Lvova-Belova met Ramzan Kanzyrov, she claimed that hundreds of children, including Ukrainian children from the occupied Donetsk and Lugansk regions, were taken on a tour to Chechnya. This is where the children visited military grounds and they listened to the lectures about the heroes of the Russian Guards. When we think about the further future fate of the children, we are talking about these children being fostered. I mentioned the boarding school number 1. 20 children were taken to the Moscow region to be transferred to the Russian families. In June, Maria Lvova-Belova claimed that this example would be followed by other Russian regions where 180 Ukrainian children were adopted by Russian families. It's worth noting that there is a financial gain for the Russian families. They would receive a one-time payment depending on whether this is a kid with a physical impairments or if they are underage or if they adopt brothers and sisters. These presume monthly payments. Altogether, this comes down to a single policy in the vertical structure of power of the Russian Federation. It is aiming at dislocating Ukrainian children, disrupting their family ties, and it all constitutes a crime of genocide. Yesterday, we heard a children's commissioner in Ukraine. She mentioned that there is another pretext for Russians to take our children away, the medical examinations, following which, under different circumstances, parents are made to allow their children to go to these so-called resorts of the healthcare movement. What do you see? What your organization has put on record? What are other pretexts for the Russian authorities to take our children away? Indeed, this is a horrendous thing to say. What we are seeing is that children are relocated to the Russian Federation under different pretexts. Indeed, children are examined. The parents receive a proposal for these children to go to the resorts and camping sites where indeed there is in place a system of re-education. But I want to cry out, it makes me cry out about the following. We have paid a lot of attention to the deported children. The first children to be deported was in Crimea, the so-called Train of Hope. And we didn't pay enough attention to that. And this Ukrainian state, which is a shame, didn't pay much attention to that, let alone international community. Well, you see, there is a train with children, and we have lost sight of those children. We will never be able to identify where they are. It makes me cry out, because we don't want to mention the children who, in the Crimea, in the so-called People's Republics, are living under occupation. They have not been transferred. They have been re-educated. They have been re-educated for 9 years. I want to cry out because in the Zaporizhia and other regions, they are following the so-called Crimea scenario of re-education of children. What does that imply? It implies a complete ban to the history of their people, to the culture of their people, to the language of their nation. A complete ban. And even when a special kid would dare to claim that she or he is a Ukrainian kid, these children are put under the so-called denazification course. We have seen on television children saying, "I am sorry that I abused the Russian people. Now that I have gone this course, I have understood everything. Glory to the Russian Federation." When I see this, I know the humiliation these children gone through. You will know that Putin mentioned in one of his speeches that the goal of this war is to free Ukraine and to mop it up from the Nazi-oriented people and Nazi ideology. What does that mean, liberate? They liberate us from our younger generation, from our children that are being deported. They're liberating us with what is going on in their heads. They liberate Ukraine with what they call a greater Russia. They seem to be enthusiastic about it. It's not liberation, it's substitution. Let us remember today more than 1 million children who are now being liberated from feeling Ukrainians. Million children, not 29,000 of them that have been deported. 1 million children are being now liberated. They are being re-educated. They are claiming such things. We have put together a paper that says that the children are the goal of their war. There are specific subjects and people who are doing this, including the church. There are special mechanisms, indoctrination, militarization, a full-scale destruction of the Ukrainian cultural component in education, and the war propaganda. The war propaganda is the most horrendous thing among all of them. I have to share with you a couple of stories. When I say 9 years in occupation, well, what will happen after these territories? And these children have been liberated. They have been liberated from their motherland, from their families. And we know about a guy born in 1999 in the city of Simferopol. He attended school number 29, and perhaps he dreamt of some visits, but he for sure did not dream about the war. In 2016, he graduated from his school. It took 2 years for this guy, Ilya, by his name, to be called up to the Russian military. On the 9th of July 2092, the boy Ilya was killed in Ukraine because he was killing Ukrainians. The boy Ilya, is he a criminal, or is this boy a victim? This is the question that everybody will face here once we have returned our Crimea. Another story to share. The boy by the name of Sasha, born in 2001, he was 13 at that point of occupation. He was living in the city of Yevpatoria in the family of the military. But in his school, there came a cadet class. This boy, for some reason, decided that it is cool to be part of the war, so he volunteered for the war in Ukraine and died. We are very likely to put together a memorial board where we will feature all the kids that have been killed, because the re-education process in the occupied territories does not only presupposes a program, it means the death toll of the Ukrainian children fighting against Ukraine. Today, on the International Children's Day, I don't know what to do. Should I be crying about the million of children that we have left behind in the occupied territories? Perhaps we will be helped by the Ukrainian state, by all the peoples of the world, by the international community, but these children should be protected. I am very emotional, but I think today's day warrants such an mood. We know about the internationally recognized crimes against humanity by the Russian Federation. Let us now talk about the OSCE's report that has been recently published. It's a most comprehensive report on the situation of the deported children of the Ukrainian state. The experts of the Moscow mechanisms by the OSCE draw the conclusion that it is a crime against humanity and a war crime to forcibly remove children from the territory of Ukraine. It also breaches the principle of children to have a family, education, access to information, to health, to rest, and the freedom of conscience and religions. The experts of the mechanisms have not noticed a point when the Russian Federation would take into account the interests of the children themselves for them to be reunited with their families. Because according to the international humanitarian law, children can be separated from their parents if this separation is doing good for these children. And now what we are seeing is that the children are under torture and they are inhumanely treated. The report also notices that the children that are forcibly removed to Russian Federation are parentless children who have been in the custody of institutionalized educational facilities. They are going to Russia unguided by their parents, or if they have been separated from their parents, in the so-called filtration camps. The report also enlists a number of measures that the Russian Federation is taking on board to remove our children, including evacuation because of the allegedly safety concerns. That's why these experts of the mechanisms are drawing the conclusion that the removal of the Kherson boarding school constitutes a war crime and a crime against humanity. Another pretext taken by the Russian Federation to give the children to be fostered in their new families. They are targeting in the first place the orphan children and children that don't have parents to change and erase their Ukrainian identity. They are also taking children for the so-called health care needs. Parents are promised that after some period of time, these children would come back, but Russia is not living up to their commitments. The Moscow mechanism experts are also drawing a conclusion, saying that they recognize a first deportation took place back in 2013 through the so-called, and what we mentioned today, the train of hope. Children were taken to Russia, and we have lost sight of those children. We don't know where their destiny is. Now Russia is taking a new effort to take a new wave of Ukrainian children. The new fostering families are being paid for such an effort, and these families are made to re-educate the Ukrainian children in a mode that the Russian Federation wants them to be reared up. Russia is also imposing their citizenship on our children, and to do this they have changed their legislation. Such an act is part of the war criminal charges. It breaches the Convention on Children's Rights. Russia is also preventing children from coming back to Ukraine. According to the Geneva Conventions, it is something that the occupying power must come up with. That is the list of the children that have been transferred from Ukraine to Russia. But the experts of the mechanisms seem to state that such an institution does not exist at all. That's why Ukraine cannot receive the lists of the children that have been transferred to Russia, and to start a process of their return. The report also enlists the commitments that Russia undergoes according to the international law. One of the most important thing is that Russia is under obligation to pay the families and the children for these victimized children, and such people must be brought to justice. The report includes proposals for both Ukraine, Russia, and international communities. One recommendation includes the point that state must provide psychological health and healthcare services to these children. The Russian Federation has the recommendation to set up a mechanism that would care for the psychological and national identity of the Ukrainian children. There are a couple of references in the report, including what we have been doing, the going of the children to these campsites, and of course it does not have any signs of the goodwill of those children. Neither does it indicate any desire of their parents for such a move. Recently, we have seen a lot of information about the transfer of Ukrainian children to Belarus. It is done under the initiative of the President Lukashenko, and Alexei Tihran is responsible for such a program. He personally said, and we know for sure that these are two campsites in the territory of Belarus where children from Lugansk and Donetsk region, including newly occupied territories, were taken into. The children in such circumstances meet the Orthodox activists, the representatives of the Belarusian youth committees, and are subjugated to participate in different TV shows, whether they claim that they are Russian citizens now. We know also that Russian President Putin has given a green light to a new legislation saying that the territories where the military curfew has been imposed, it gives the right to take the children away into the territories where the curfew or the martial law has not been announced. It means that we will find it very difficult to know how many children have been forcibly transferred to the Russian Federation. It is clear now that we must set up a single mechanism to secure the return of the Ukrainian children based on the international law and will take into account best interests of the children. Our center is working on such a program to support the families whose children have been deported into the Russian Federation. Our expert, Katerina Kryshevskaya, is now on her field trip to the United States, where she will gain a lot of expertise. She will be meeting people from the UN bodies, from the United States, the different institutions, to make sure that the UN resolutions on the deported children will be used as the groundwork for the reintegration, rehabilitation, and return of the Ukrainian children that have been recently transferred to Russia. Ms. Anastasia, we know a lot of examples where our children are humiliated. We have heard such examples today. People are abused because they use the Ukrainian flag, they sing Ukrainian songs, they call the occupiers. But the recent example is in the city of Berdiansk, where our children are brought in for the criminal charges for allegedly sabotage terrorist act. How can we secure that their rights are guaranteed? How can we help them?
В випадках цивільних заручників.
You see, in the recent times, we have been focusing on the civil procedures, but when we know that the civilians were taken hostages, we knew the information that the Russian military would take photographs of the children, of their documents, just to make sure that they control such people. And such both prisoners of war and civilian hostages got stuck in the occupied territories. They felt that they are under psychological pressure, but they knew that the occupying force has their documents, knows a lot about their families, so we consider them to be civilian hostages. We also know the examples when in the territory of the Donetsk region, the parents were taken hostage, and they were taken into the places where they have been put were deprived of their freedom, and children were left all alone. We heard from a woman who came back to Ukraine, and she said that the authorities would come to her and threaten her that your kid would be deported to Russian Federation, so the parents wouldn't know where their children were, whether they had been already deported. In the confinement cell in the Donetsk region and in Kherson, we heard a witness saying that she was arrested by the Russian authorities and a kid was living in their flat all alone. She also doesn't know where the kid is. We also are aware of a special category. These are children whose families have been stressed by different living circumstances, whether these are needy families or children that are health impaired in terms of their health. The occupying authorities know somehow the state of such children. In the social media, we see the Russian volunteers, the doctors, or the military, and more often than not, they have the possibility of accessing the local population in the occupied territories. They claim that they would help such children, and they take the children away. Then they put the video with these children claiming that these kids are being helped, their parents have died. And we also know the events in Mariupol after all the shellings that the city had seen. The military would go along the street and identifying children whose parents had been killed. These children were taken away and they were transported into one hospital. Then the children went somewhere near Moscow. These children have been fostered now in the territory of the Russian Federation. The minority of the parents, of the guardians, very few of those have been able to reclaim their children. We also know that there are some public social network resources in the Russian Federation where they say that we are ready to take a Ukrainian kid for the summertime, for them to have some good time here. And one of the demands that they want to see is the so-called motivational video, claiming that such a family is ready to provide rearing and upbringing for such a child. We don't know the destiny of such children. And the last point to make, and this is in our presentation, I would like to draw attention of the international community. 2 minors born in 2016, they are in the occupied territory of the Zaporizhia region. In later September, one of these kids' families saw Russian military coming into their household. The granny was at home, and the kid was taken away. His granny was strolling along the streets trying to find where he was. 5 days later, it was known that the kid was held in the administration building where the Ukrainian law enforcement used to be housed before the war, and the civil hostages were held there. So this kid was among the civilian hostages. Later, we learned that the boy was taken to the so-called interrogation. He was the subject of the mockery shooting. Then he was released. So, but his classmate found himself almost in the same situation. He was not held among the civilian hostages, but he was interrogated. He was morally and psychologically pressured. And it is known that on the 24th of May, these children were presented with the suspicion, and allegedly they will go under trial. We should be aware that these children don't enjoy any judicial aid under the occupation. My colleagues have researched the justice system in the occupied territories. They have drawn a conclusion that this is a sham and quasi-system of justice. They don't have any independent bodies of jurisdiction ready or willing to help these children or children like them. These children, it should be remembered, since autumn of last year, are actually under the house arrest. They have the right to go out, but they have to register with the occupying authorities to make sure that they have not left that territory. One of the parents of one of these kids strove to take them away, but this parent was arrested, and then the parent was allowed to come back to Ukraine, but children are staying still there, which is to say that these children, like other Ukrainian children, are being tortured, as are the civilian hostages, as are the rights of our prisoners of war rights are being egregiously violated. The advocacy point, what is the role of advocacy in all this horrendous, terrific, tragic actions that the occupier is subjecting our children to? How can we engage the media to make sure that these children are helped? And we should be aware of all the risks under such circumstances. Well, I think we have exhausted the list of all the breaches and abuses. You can hardly imagine the depth of these violations, and we want to make sure that these people will not go unpunished. But to summarize what we have heard today, my colleagues have mentioned already that the forced removal, relocation, and deportation is part of the internationally recognized war crimes. This is what Russia has been doing since 2014, and they are using such steps as the war campaign mechanisms. There are three categories to be mindful of: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. It all depends on the number of proven cases where we can ultimately come up with a definition or categorization. To at least somehow soften the consequences for these children, what can we do? One thing is to bring those responsible into account. One of the things that we know for sure is the mechanisms that can be used by different international bodies, the countries that will be brokering the relations between the warring countries. It's all written down in the Geneva Conventions. And the war that we are now seeing in Ukraine, this war aggression of Russian Federation, we don't seem to be taking advantage of such mechanisms. We seem to have wasted a lot of time, although these mechanisms could have been used to protect our children and to prevent their forced deportation to the Russian Federation. The alternative here is the use of the third party country who have consular relations with the Russian Federation, the country that could take on them helping Ukraine to set up some consular relations for the Ukrainian citizens now in the territory of Russia. When we talk about the renovation, renewal of their passport, their documentation, their certificates, birth certificates, and other documents, or in case the documents have been destroyed in the course of the hostilities, such a mechanism has not been taken advantage of. But there are different NGOs and governmental organizations. We must initiate such a use of mechanisms internationally, both in the United States, where the representative of our organization is now, and of course, she's talking about the use of the justice mechanisms to be used. Our colleagues have gone to different countries to put up this issue on the highest priority list. There is another point. We cannot pay lip service and to brush away the role of the Red Cross. When we talk about the monitoring and providing health care for children or the civilian population, the Ukrainian citizens in the occupied territories or in the territories under the Russian control, such international organizations can set up such a mechanisms, and through the network of the European ombudsmen and women who are responsible for caring to children's care, they can legitimately visit occupied territories, visit the Ukrainian children, as well as visiting Ukrainian civilians to inspect and monitor the information about their health state, about the state of their human rights, whether Russia is living up to the international humanitarian law. Russia is a signature state of the Geneva Convention. And although they are signatories, we must claim that they would admit what they are living up to and the rules that they are violating. My colleagues have mentioned the future holding to justice those responsible. We are talking about the recent G7 summit, where the initiative on the international setting up of the International Criminal Court has been approved, but that court is likely to be dealing with act of aggression alone. But we are talking about the abuse of the children's rights, and we are talking about the hybrid justice system, where both international and national law enforcement bodies would be engaged, and they would be able to include the major Ukrainian context to know for sure what's going on here in Ukraine. Thank you. I would like to invite questions from the floor. Ukrinform Irina Kožihar. There is a lot more information about the role and responsibility of Belarus in the forced deportation of the Ukrainian children. Do you have anything to add here? Who is ready to answer that question?
Ми знаємо, що ще з 20
As for Belarus, we know that on the 24th of February, with a new phase of the full-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine, yes, they deported children through the area of Chernobyl nuclear power plant, not only children, but the civilian population as hostages. There are facts that have been recorded nationally, and we have initiated criminal investigations on that claim. It has been investigated by the Ukrainian State Security Service. That's what I know for sure. Perhaps my colleagues know more than I do.
Так, і зокрема про згадані факти.
We have mentioned the facts. What we know is this. As of September 2022, there was a program going on in Belarus about the camping site where 200 Ukrainian children were forcibly taken into. It was reported by the national Belarusian media, and they claimed that their plan was to take away what they call hot spaces in Ukraine to receive and accommodate more than 1,000 children. To wrap it up, I would put this question. You mentioned the third-party role. Not everyone knows that the children that have been officially identified, the number is more than 20,000 today. There are other estimates. What is there for the third parties, international bodies, in one way or the other, to impact this process of identifying the children that have been deported? You believe that it will be an effectual process, and this is a reality. Indeed, currently the only chance we have to return those that have been identified. But there are children that have not been identified yet. Their number might reach as high number as 700,000. There must be a comprehensive mechanism in place. And the third party, of course, is likely to play a key role. OSCE, for example, might be acting as a third party actor. Then there would likely be an agreement between Ukraine and a third party, between Russia and a third party. And such an agreement would imply that we would have a list of children that have been deported. This will be the first step on the way to return those children, with the interest that, with the claim that it would serve the best interests of such children. But Russia is reluctant to set up such a list. When we look at the pace that Russia is now replying to our claims, it'll take 50 years at least. There are specific persons, parents who know that their children are in Russia. Specific missions are set up. They must find contacts in the Russian authority, but it all takes time. It's a financially complicated. It is psychologically difficult. It is not safe. So this process to make sure that not a single child is left behind in Russia, it would simply and of course imply the role of a third party agreement. That seems to be the only way to make sure that children are coming back. Now, here is my question. Has Ukraine initiated such a process? To the best of my knowledge, I think I read that on the website of the president, to the point that there is a program, Bring Children Back, UA, that seems to start this process. It's difficult to say now what the details are, what is the future of that program, because it implies the repatriation and reintegration of such children, taking on board different governmental bodies. It's difficult to say at this point in time what is the essence of such a program, how effective it will be. Perhaps in the nearest weeks or months we'll see whether government is taking the right steps. We have other questions from the floor. Matej Schulz from the radio Slovakia. Can I ask you a question in English?
Because I know last year, after liberation of Kherson, for example, parents could go to Crimea and took kids, even if it was dangerous. from summer camps. If we talk about this, how is it now? Are those kids still in the camps, or is there any process how to repatriate them, or they are like all in Russia and we are waiting for this official repatriation system that you mentioned? What is the situation right now?
Хто візьметься за?
А якою мовою?
What language would you prefer? The process is still ongoing. The parents that have the documents testifying their relations and kinship to these children, they, as my colleague has mentioned, a possibility with our experts go to Russia, find contacts among the Russian officials, show the documents, and take children back. But we think that there are children that no one came to see or came to reclaim. Their parents might have been killed. There are different circumstances in different families. We must find who are the people responsible for this kid. They would have to go to Russia. Russia is taking advantage of this. They say that these children are unattended, there are no people that would care for them, and our mission is to find people here in Ukraine who are responsible for these children and to motivate such parents to go to Russia and claim their children, or if not parents, then guardians. We also know about different camping sites in the Crimea, in Russia per se. And these children were relocated from one place to another. These children were put together. They would go to one place, then to another place. Some children ended up near Moscow. There is an information that must be verified yet. We know about children in the Voronezh region, a specialized institution that is taking care of the so-called special children with special needs. These children, no one has yet volunteered to go to see them.
Transportation of children has been like tens of thousands, and we know such events since like last summer. But the return of the children, the process has been very slow, even with the involvement of like various NGOs. Like, I want to know like what are the difficulties among them, and what are the practical measures that Ukraine is doing to facilitate and speed up the process of the return? Thank you.
Я думаю, що
I think the most important issue here and challenge is that we don't have a verified information on the number of children and the way to identify them, children who are in the territory of Russia. The information access is not granted to them, is not granted to us. We know about the so-called guardian state. We talked to the Switzerland state, and they seem to be willing to participate as a intermediary, but Russia declines such an option. So international community doesn't have access to information. Russia is not granting this information. To save children, we must know how many of them, where they are, and who they are. We don't have such information. This is the major challenge we face. The initiative that we have already mentioned, we'll see how it's going to unfold. But advocacy, both by the NGOs and by the government bodies, is very important to make sure that the international community is pressuring Russia. Without the pressure from the international community, we are destined to fail to secure the access to the information about the number and the identities of the children that have been forcibly removed. Thank you very much for taking such an interest. Thank you, the panelists here, for such an exhaustive information. We are working towards our ultimate victory. We hope that all our children are coming back to their families and that they are safe. Thank you very much. Thank you, the Ukrainian military, to making sure that we have such briefings, and glory to Ukraine.